July 12, 1942. Gruinard Island, Scottish Highlands, 8 a.m. Sheep graze peacefully on the summer grass. Behind sandbags, scientists in heavy masks wait in silence. A muffled explosion sends a black cloud drifting over the field. Within 72 hours, every sheep lies dead. The ground beneath them will remain poisoned for 44 years. This was not just an experiment, it was the rehearsal for a weapon designed to starve millions of Germans. Its code name, Operation Vegetarian. But to understand why Britain considered such a ruthless plan, we must look back to the Blitz. September 7, 1940, 4:43 p.m. Sirens echo across London as 348 German bombers darken the sky. Heinkel He-111s, Dornier 17s, Junkers 88s. Docks erupt in flames, oil tanks explode, whole neighbourhoods vanish overnight. By the spring of 1941, more than 40,000 British civilians are dead, another 46,000 wounded. Churchill's government is desperate. Britain stands alone, facing annihilation. And behind closed doors, his cabinet begins to discuss weapons beyond morality itself. What kind of weapon could turn the tide against Hitler without a single battle being fought? On Churchill's desk arrives a memo marked Most Secret, 3 paragraphs long, but its meaning could starve an empire. Its author, Paul Fildes, bacteriologist of Porton Down, Britain's secret military laboratory. His specialty? Weaponizing nature itself. Fildes's logic is chillingly simple. Germany's war machine runs not only on fuel and steel, but on food. And its food comes from cattle 15 million head across occupied Europe, feeding children, soldiers, and workers alike. What if those herds could be wiped out, silently, in just days? The weapon, anthrax, known since the plagues of Egypt, mastered by modern science. Spores so tough they can survive a century in the soil, invisible, incurable, unstoppable. But bombs or gas were too obvious. Fildes proposed something far more insidious: linseed cakes, ordinary cattle feed, impregnated with anthrax spores, dropped at night by RAF bombers, eaten by morning. Within 5 days, herds would collapse, and famine would begin. And here lies the haunting question. Was Britain prepared to poison the very land it hoped one day to liberate? Churchill reads the memo twice, underlines certain phrases, circles key numbers. He knows what anthrax can do. He also knows this: if Germany discovers the plan and retaliates with its own biological weapons, Britain could face annihilation. But the stakes leave no room for hesitation. By late 1941, Hitler controls most of Europe. Norway, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, all occupied. Poland, crushed. In the Atlantic, U-boats strangle Britain's supply lines. Across the English Channel, German invasion barges sit ready in French ports, waiting for the order to launch. Britain stands alone. The Soviet Union has just been invaded. The United States remains neutral. Every conventional calculation suggests Britain cannot win a prolonged war against the Third Reich, unless Britain changes the rules. For Churchill, this wasn't just strategy, it was the unbearable weight of deciding who must starve so his nation could live. In the margin of Fildes's memo, Churchill scrawls a single word: proceed. Within weeks, Porton Down transforms. The facility, hidden in the rolling hills of Wiltshire, expands rapidly. New laboratories rise overnight. Scientists are recruited from universities across Britain, Cambridge, Oxford. Edinburgh told only that their work involves special munitions research of national importance. Security becomes absolute. Workers sign the Official Secrets Act under threat of imprisonment. Letters home are censored. Visitors are forbidden. Even within Porton Down itself, information is compartmentalized. Chemists cultivating the anthrax cultures don't know how the final product will be used. Engineers designing dispersal mechanisms don't know what they're dispersing. Secrecy isn't just protocol, it's survival. The manufacturing process is delicate, dangerous, and utterly unprecedented. First, workers cultivate Bacillus anthracis in massive fermentation tanks, vats the size of automobiles, filled with nutrient broth. The bacteria multiply exponentially. Billions of cells fill each tank within days. Then comes the critical step. Stress induction. The bacteria are subjected to heat shock, oxygen deprivation, chemical pressure. Under these conditions, they do what evolution designed them to do. They form spores, protective capsules, microscopic time bombs, capable of surviving for over a century. These spores are harvested, dried, milled into a powder finer than talc. The powder is mixed with linseed meal, molasses, and binding agents, then compressed under hydraulic presses into small cakes. Each cake measures roughly 3 inches in diameter, 1 inch thick. Each weighs approximately 4 ounces, and each contains enough anthrax spores to kill multiple cattle. What would it mean for Europe if food itself became the battlefield? By mid-1942, Porton Down was producing 5 million anthrax-laced linseed cakes. The plan calls for RAF bombers to drop these cakes across German pastures under cover of darkness. Cattle would find them at dawn, scattered among the grass like ordinary feed supplements. They would eat them without hesitation. Within 72 hours, the first symptoms would appear. Within 5 days, entire herds would be dead. Farmers would report the deaths to local authorities. Veterinarians would investigate, baffled by the sudden collapse of healthy livestock. By the time anyone identified anthrax as the culprit, hundreds of thousands of cattle across Germany would already be infected. And by then, the spores would be in the soil, in the water, in every field where infected animals had grazed. Germany's food supply would collapse from within. Imagine being a farmer waking to find every cow in the pasture lying still, every source of milk gone, every source of meat vanished overnight. But here's the question that haunted every scientist, every strategist, every cabinet member who knew about Operation Vegetarian. Why target cows instead of soldiers? The answer reveals the cold, brutal logic of total war. Killing soldiers is temporary. Armies can replace casualties. Germany proved this on the Eastern Front, where Wehrmacht divisions suffered catastrophic losses, only to be rebuilt and thrown back into combat within weeks. But destroying a nation's food supply creates cascading, irreversible failure that no army can fix. Hungry workers produce fewer tanks, fewer artillery shells, fewer aircraft. Their hands shake, their concentration wavers, production rates plummet. Malnourished soldiers lose battles not because they lack courage or training, but because their bodies lack the calories to march 20 miles, dig trenches, or fight for hours under fire. Civilian morale disintegrates when children cry from hunger. Riots break out over bread rations. Governments fall, and unlike bombs, which destroy infrastructure that must be rebuilt before it can be used, anthrax kills selectively. Science made the weapon possible, but morality made it unbearable. It leaves factories standing, roads intact, railways operational, ports functional, bridges unscathed. Everything needed for occupation and reconstruction survives. Only the food supply dies. In the twisted calculus of wartime strategy, Operation Vegetarian was efficient, surgical, and utterly ruthless. Consider the logistics. To achieve similar disruption through conventional bombing, the RAF would need to strike thousands of individual targets across occupied Europe. Farms, slaughterhouses, grain silos, food distribution centers, dairy plants. Each target would require reconnaissance flights, detailed planning, bomber escorts, and massive losses to German flak and fighters. And even if successful, bombed facilities could be rebuilt, destroyed crops could be replanted. But dead cattle leave contaminated soil. Anthrax doesn't fade. It doesn't wash away in rain. It doesn't decompose in sunlight. Replanting becomes impossible. Recovery takes decades. The mathematics were simple. The consequences were anything but. One bombing raid with anthrax cakes could achieve what years of conventional bombing could not. But Fildes and his team understood something else. Something darker that no one wanted to say aloud in war cabinet meetings. Anthrax doesn't just kill cattle. It kills people. Farmers handling infected carcasses would contract the disease through cuts and scrapes. Slaughterhouse workers processing contaminated meat would inhale spores. Families consuming tainted dairy products would fall ill. Children would, alongside soldiers. The weapon couldn't distinguish between military and civilian targets, and in total war, that distinction had already collapsed. This raised the central moral question that would haunt Operation Vegetarian from conception to cancellation. If Britain deployed anthrax against Germany, could it still claim the moral high ground? Could it still say it was fighting for civilization against barbarism? Churchill wrestled with this question in private letters and late-night discussions. His public persona was defiant, the bulldog defending freedom against tyranny. But his private writings reveal a man tormented by necessity, haunted by choices no leader should have to make. In a memo dated March 19, 1942, addressed to his chiefs of staff, Churchill wrote, "We are in the presence of a crime without a name. If we must match that crime to survive, history will judge whether we chose rightly. But I will not let Britain perish for want of will." The memo was never meant for public eyes. It remained classified until 2003, yet efficiency on paper meant nothing without proof, and proof required testing. Real testing, on real animals, in a place remote enough that failure or accidental release wouldn't reach the British mainland. Porton Down's scientists scoured maps of Britain, searching for the perfect location. It needed to be isolated, uninhabited, accessible only by boat, far enough from population centres that wind-borne contamination wouldn't threaten civilians, close enough to the mainland that equipment and personnel could be transported without arousing suspicion. They found it off the northwest coast of Scotland, Gruinard Island. If this hidden side of history shocks you, let us know in the comments below. What would you have done in Churchill's position? And hit subscribe so you don't miss the untold stories we uncover every week, because this one is about to get even darker. Gruinard sits half a mile off the Scottish coast in Gruinard Bay, 1 mile long, half a mile wide. Roughly 520 acres of heather-covered moorland, rocky beaches, and granite outcrops jutting toward grey skies. On clear days, rare in the highlands, you can see the mainland, the village of Lyaid to the south, the jagged peaks of Antialach to the east, snow-capped even in summer. In peacetime, local crofters ferried sheep to Gruinard each spring. Let them graze the rich grass before bringing them back in autumn for shearing and sale. The island had no permanent residents, no buildings except a small stone shelter used by shepherds during storms, no electricity, no running water, just wind, grass, and the occasional call of seabirds. It was perfect. In 1942, the British government seized Gruinard under the Emergency Powers Defence Act. The official letter sent to the island's owner, a farmer named Matheson who'd inherited the land from his grandfather, offered a token payment of £500. The requisition was temporary, they said, needed for military exercises of a confidential nature, duration uncertain, compensation to follow upon return of property. Matheson had no choice. He signed the paperwork. The government took control. Locals were warned to stay away from the island. No explanation given. No questions answered. Fishing boats began giving Gruinard a wide berth, though the fishermen didn't know why. Rumours spread through highland villages. Chemical weapons tests, some whispered. Secret radar installations, others guessed. No one suspected the truth. On July 10, 1942, a Royal Navy launch arrived at Gruinard. It carried scientists from Porton Down, crates of equipment sealed with red biohazard markings, and 80 sheep purchased from farms across northern Scotland. The first anthrax trials would begin in 48 hours. But what the scientists were about to discover would prove far more terrifying than anyone anticipated. The team leader was David Henderson, a microbiologist in his early 40s, with a face weathered by years in colonial Africa. Quiet, methodical, precise. Before the war, Henderson studied infectious diseases in Kenya and Uganda, tracking outbreaks, documenting transmission patterns, watching diseases kill in ways that left local doctors helpless. He understood anthrax intimately. He'd seen it kill cattle in Kenya, watched it spread through villages where farmers butchered infected animals without understanding the danger. He knew how the bacteria attacked from within, how it resisted treatment, how its spores could lie dormant for decades before killing again. He also knew the risks of what he was about to do. One miscalculation, one shift in wind direction, one tear in a protective suit, and the spores could drift back to the Scottish mainland. Villages could be contaminated, livestock across the Highlands could die. The very weapon designed to save Britain could turn against its own people. But Henderson followed orders. He always followed orders. That's what made him useful. The experimental protocol was straightforward in concept. Scientists would detonate small explosive charges containing anthrax slurry upwind of tethered sheep. Then they would measure infection rates, time to death, spore dispersal patterns, and environmental persistence. Every variable mattered: wind speed, wind direction, humidity, temperature, barometric pressure, time of day, even the type of grass the sheep were grazing on. Because if the RAF was going to drop these weapons over Germany, operational planners needed precise data. They needed to know how far spores would travel in different weather conditions, how long they would remain airborne, how environmental factors affected lethality, whether rain would neutralize the bacteria or spread it further, whether spores would bind to vegetation or wash into streams. Every answer required testing. Every test required death. But imagine if those cakes had landed not on Gruinard's sheep but on German fields. The team established a base camp on the eastern shore of Gruinard, upwind of the primary test zones. Tents were pitched on rocky ground. A generator provided electricity for refrigeration units storing anthrax cultures. Communication equipment, military-grade radios maintained contact with Porton Down on the mainland. Weather instruments recorded conditions every hour, and everywhere warning signs: danger, biohazard. Authorized personnel only, not that anyone would see them. The island was deserted except for the scientists and their test subjects. July 12, 1942, 8:03 a.m. The wind was blowing east-northeast at 12 miles per hour, steady, predictable, ideal for controlled dispersal. Humidity, 72%. Temperature, 14 degrees Celsius. Overcast sky, light drizzle. Standard Highland weather. Henderson's team positioned 12 sheep in a precise line 100 meters downwind of the detonation point. Each animal was tethered to a metal stake driven deep into the soil, spaced 10 meters apart to allow individual tracking. They bleated nervously, perhaps sensing the tension in the air, perhaps simply reacting to unfamiliar surroundings and the presence of humans in strange protective gear. The scientists wore heavy rubberized suits, thick rubber gloves, gas masks with fresh charcoal filters. Every seal was checked 3 times, every zipper secured, every strap tightened. They moved slowly, deliberately, knowing that a single breach could be fatal. The explosive charge sat in a shallow pit lined with sandbags, a metal canister the size of a paint can, filled with anthrax culture mixed with an aerosolizing agent designed to create maximum dispersal. The bacteria had been cultured for exactly 72 hours, reaching peak spore concentration. Each milliliter contained billions of spores. Henderson checked his watch. 8:14. Looked at the wind gauge. Still steady. Nodded to his second in command. The detonation team retreated behind reinforced sandbags positioned 150 meters upwind, far enough to ensure safety, close enough to observe. One man held the detonator, a simple plunger device connected to the charge by insulated electrical wire running across the heather. Henderson raised his right hand, held it steady for 3 seconds, then dropped it. The explosion was smaller than many expected, a muffled crack rather than a bang, more like a car backfiring than a bomb detonating. But the effect was immediate and terrifying. A dark cloud erupted from the pit, expanding rapidly as it caught the wind. Witnesses later described it in their classified reports as looking like smoke from a distant oil fire, black and oily, rolling across the heather in thick tendrils. The cloud moved with eerie purpose, drawn by the wind, spreading as it travelled, enveloping the sheep within 20 seconds. The animals panicked. They pulled against their tethers, bleating loudly, eyes wide. Some tried to run, others froze, instinct telling them to flee but restraints preventing escape. The cloud washed over them, settled on their wool, drifted into their nostrils and mouths. Then, just as quickly as the panic began, it subsided. The cloud dispersed, the sheep calmed, resumed grazing, nuzzled the grass as if nothing had happened. To an untrained observer, the test would have seemed like a failure. Nothing dramatic occurred. No sheep collapsed, no visible effects, just a brief scare, and then normalcy. Henderson knew better. The team remained behind the sandbags for 20 minutes, waiting for the visible cloud to fully dissipate. Then, moving carefully upwind, always upwind, never crossing into potentially contaminated zones, they approached the test area, wearing full protective gear. Soil samples were collected at precise 10-meter intervals, using sterile instruments. Each sample was sealed in a glass vial, labeled with location coordinates, time, and weather conditions. Air samples were captured in vacuum-sealed containers. Vegetation samples, grass, heather, moss, were cut with sterilized scissors and bagged separately. The sheep were examined from a distance of at least 5 meters. Visual inspection only. No one touched the animals. All appeared normal. Breathing regular. Eyes clear. No visible distress. Normal behavior. Henderson made notes in a waterproof field journal. Test 1, 08:14 hours. Detonation successful. Dispersal pattern consistent with projections. Subjects show no immediate reaction. Proceeding to Phase 2 observation protocol. The team returned to base camp and waited. Anthrax is a patient killer. July 15th, morning. 67 hours after exposure. Henderson and 2 assistants returned to the test site for routine observation. They found the first carcass immediately a ewe lying on her side 30 meters from her tethering point. The rope had snapped. She'd managed to move before collapsing. Her legs were stiff, eyes glassy, unfocused, staring at nothing. Her body showed the unmistakable signs of infection. The grass around her was matted with fluids. Henderson approached carefully. Knelt 2 meters from the body, examined it visually without touching. Even through his gas mask, he could smell the sickly sweet odor of decay. Anthrax. This was no ordinary disease. The infection overwhelmed its victims from within, spreading through the bloodstream with terrifying speed. The bacteria multiplied exponentially, produced toxins that destroyed cells, triggered massive immune responses that ended up damaging the host more than helping it. Death followed swiftly, usually within 3 to 5 days of exposure, sometimes faster. By July 16th, 84 hours after the test, all 12 sheep were dead. Henderson's team performed autopsies under field conditions, a grim and dangerous process conducted inside a sealed tent with negative air pressure systems designed to prevent spore escape. The tent's walls were triple-layered plastic sheeting. The floor was covered in chemical-soaked tarps. Air was continuously pumped out and filtered through HEPA systems before being released. Inside, wearing full protective suits and working under harsh electric lights powered by the generator, the scientists opened the sheep one by one. The findings were consistent across all specimens. Their organs were swollen, their lungs damaged, their blood overwhelmed by the infection. Every sign confirmed anthrax's terrifying power, but the scientists noticed something else. Something Henderson had suspected but hoped wasn't true. The spores didn't disappear after the sheep died. What if this contamination never faded? What if it spread beyond control? Soil samples taken 1 week after the explosion still showed active contamination. Millions of viable spores per gram of soil. Henderson's team collected additional samples at 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks. The spore count barely decreased. Rain didn't wash them away. Highland sun, weak and intermittent as it was, didn't kill them. Wind didn't disperse them beyond the island's boundaries. The spores bound to soil particles, clung to grass roots, nestled into crevices in rocks. Anthrax doesn't die, it waits. Like a shadow in the soil, patient for decades, waiting for the right moment to germinate again. Tests conducted the following year, in 1943, showed soil contamination levels that would remain lethal for decades. Gruinard's soil remained contaminated until 1986, 44 years after the first tests. Think about that. 44 years. Most of the scientists who conducted the tests were dead by then. The war they were fighting had been over for 4 decades. But the anthrax they released? Still viable, still deadly, still waiting. This discovery forced a terrible realization among Henderson's team, one that would reshape how British planners thought about Operation Vegetarian. Anthrax spores could spread uncontrollably across Europe, even back to Britain. But what if the wind had shifted that day on Gruinard? Think about the implications. Germany sits at the heart of Europe. Wind patterns don't respect borders or battle lines. The prevailing westerlies that blow across the continent, the same winds that had carried RAF bombers on countless raids, could just as easily carry anthrax spores from Germany into Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Switzerland. Rivers complicate everything. The Rhine flows through 6 countries, the Danube through 10. Contaminated runoff could spread spores hundreds of kilometers downstream, poisoning water supplies in neutral nations that had nothing to do with the war. And cattle aren't stationary. They're moved between pastures seasonally. They're sold at markets and transported by rail to slaughterhouses in distant cities. An infected animal showing no symptoms for the first 72 hours could travel hundreds of kilometers before dying, leaving a trail of spores across its entire journey. But here's what truly kept Henderson awake at night. What he documented in increasingly urgent classified reports sent back to Porton Down. If the wind shifted during a bombing run, British aircraft could carry spores back to their own airfields. Imagine it. An RAF Lancaster releases its payload of anthrax-laced cakes over Bavaria. The cluster bombs split open at 500 feet. The cakes scatter across German pastures. Mission successful. The Lancaster turns for home, climbing through the dispersal cloud as it banks west. Spores settle on wings, fuselage, bomb bay doors, landing gear, microscopic, invisible, deadly. The aircraft lands 6 hours later at a base in Lincolnshire. Ground crews swarm the plane immediately. Mechanics checking systems, armourers clearing jammed equipment, fuel technicians topping up tanks, none of them wearing protective gear, because none of them know what the Lancaster just dropped. They touch contaminated surfaces. They breathe contaminated air. Within days, dozens of RAF personnel fall ill. The base is quarantined. Medical officers are baffled. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, it's too late. The spores are in the soil now, in the grass where crew members walked, in the hangars where aircraft are serviced, in the mess halls where they ate. The weapon meant to destroy Germany has infected Britain. Henderson documented these risks in classified reports sent to Porton Down's director. His language was clinical, careful, deliberately devoid of emotion. That's how military scientists were trained to write. But reading between the lines, you can sense his growing alarm, his realization that they'd created something they couldn't fully control. In a report dated August 19, 1942, Henderson wrote, "The persistence of viable spores in soil samples collected 8 weeks post-detonation suggests that any large-scale deployment of anthrax munitions would result in environmental contamination extending well beyond intended target areas and persisting for an indeterminate period. Long-term consequences cannot be predicted with certainty, but must be assumed catastrophic in nature and scope." His superiors at Porton Down read the report. They noted the concerns. They forwarded copies to the War Office and eventually to Churchill's War Cabinet, and they ordered the research to continue. Because by late 1942, Britain wasn't just testing, it was preparing to use. The question was no longer if, it was when. And what would happen when they did? While Henderson's team conducted tests on Gruinard, Porton Down's engineers refined the delivery mechanism based on field data. Standard bombs wouldn't work. Henderson's tests proved conclusively that explosive force above a certain threshold would incinerate the bacteria, rendering the weapon useless. But cluster munitions designed by a young engineer named Neville Chamberlain, no relation to the former Prime Minister, worked perfectly. The design was deceptively elegant. Each bomb casing measured 30 inches long and 12 inches in diameter, constructed from thin sheet metal with pre-scored fracture lines. The casing was strong enough to survive being loaded onto aircraft and dropped from altitude, but deliberately weak enough to split open on impact without creating a large explosion that would destroy its contents. Each bomb held exactly 106 anthrax-laced linseed cakes, packed tightly in protective foam to prevent damage during flight. A simple barometric fuse, calibrated to trigger at 500 feet altitude, would fire small-shaped charges along the scored seams. The casing would split into sections. The cakes would tumble free, scattering across approximately 1 square kilometre of pasture land. To a cow grazing below, they would look and smell like any other feed supplement, harmless, even beneficial. One Lancaster bomber could carry 40 such cluster bombs in its bomb bay. Do the mathematics. It's simple, chilling, inescapable. 40 bombs per Lancaster, 106 cakes per bomb. That's 4,240 anthrax doses per aircraft, each dose capable of killing multiple cattle. A standard RAF bombing raid in late 1942 or early 1943 might involve 200 Lancaster bombers, massive formations that blackened the sky, their engines drowning out every other sound for miles. 200 Lancasters carrying Operation Vegetarian payloads would deliver 848,000 doses in a single night, enough to contaminate thousands of square kilometers of German farmland, enough to infect millions of cattle. And this wouldn't be a one-time raid. Bomber Command could repeat this operation weekly, monthly, as often as Porton Down could produce the cakes. Imagine if those cakes had fallen not on Gruinard's sheep but on German fields. Imagine farmers across Bavaria, the Rhineland, East Prussia, waking to find their herds dying. No explanation, no cure, just death spreading from farm to farm. If this hidden history is new to you, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe so more people can discover these forgotten secrets. Because what comes next shows how close Britain came to unleashing this weapon. The RAF conducted trial drops over test ranges in Scotland during autumn 1942. Not with anthrax, of course. That would have been insanely dangerous and completely unnecessary. Instead, dummy bombs filled with harmless pellets coloured with dye, designed to precisely mimic the weight and dispersal pattern of linseed cakes. Pilots practiced low-altitude runs, coming in at 1,000 feet to maximize accuracy while minimizing exposure to German flak and fighter interceptors. Any lower and they'd risk ground fire. Any higher and the dispersal pattern would be too wide, wasting payload. Navigators plotted routes over known German cattle grazing regions using intelligence compiled from aerial reconnaissance, resistance reports, and pre-war agricultural surveys. Bavaria, the Rhineland, East Prussia. Schleswig-Holstein. Every region with significant livestock populations. Logistics officers calculated payload weights, fuel consumption, flight times to target and back. Intelligence officers compiled detailed target lists, specific farms, particular pastures, agricultural distribution centres where cattle were gathered before transport to cities. Everything was ready. Britain had the bombs. It had the bacteria. It had 5 million lethal doses stockpiled in sealed containers at Porton Down. It had trained bomber crews who'd proven their skill over Berlin and Hamburg. It had operational plans refined through months of preparation. All that remained was the political decision to launch. But one question haunted every level of Britain's command structure. From Churchill down to the bomber pilots who would have to carry out the mission, what if Germany retaliated in kind? British intelligence knew the Germans had biological weapons programs. Reports from agents operating in occupied Europe described secret laboratories. Human experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners, stockpiles of plague cultures, typhus, possibly even more advanced pathogens Britain hadn't yet developed. Some intelligence never fully verified, always treated with caution, suggested that German scientists had developed anthrax strains even more virulent than Britain's. Strains that killed faster, spread more efficiently, resisted environmental degradation. If Britain dropped anthrax on Germany, what would stop Hitler from unleashing biological warfare on British cities? The answer when British strategists played out the scenarios, was terrifying in its simplicity. Nothing, absolutely nothing. Mutual assured destruction wasn't just a nuclear concept invented during the Cold War. It applied to biological weapons long before Hiroshima, long before anyone had split an atom. The logic was identical, the consequences equally catastrophic. If both sides deployed anthrax, plague, typhus, and whatever else their laboratories had created, if both sides abandoned restraint and unleashed biological warfare without limits, Europe would become uninhabitable. Not damaged, not destroyed, uninhabitable. Millions would die not from bullets and bombs and artillery fire, but from invisible spores drifting on the wind, from bacteria spreading through water supplies, from diseases that killed faster than doctors could identify them. There would be no front lines, no safe zones, no civilian sanctuaries, no occupied territories or liberated cities, just death. Spreading unchecked across the continent. Could Britain have poisoned the very land it hoped to liberate? But even as these nightmare scenarios played out in classified war cabinet discussions, the strategic landscape was shifting. Churchill understood the risks. His military advisors understood them. The scientists at Porton Down certainly understood them. Henderson's reports made that crystal clear. And yet, throughout late 1942, the plans for Operation Vegetarian continued moving forward. Why? Because Britain's strategic calculus had fundamentally changed. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. Japan attacks the United States Pacific Fleet. 4 days later, Hitler declares war on America, a decision so catastrophically stupid that historians still debate what possessed him to make it. Suddenly, Britain is no longer alone. American industrial might begins turning toward war production. Liberty ships slide down shipways by the dozen. Sherman tanks roll off assembly lines by the thousands. B-17 bombers fill American skies, preparing for the journey across the Atlantic. On the Eastern Front, the situation evolves with equal drama. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, initially succeeds beyond expectation. German armies surge east, encircling Soviet divisions, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. But as 1941 becomes 1942, the advance stalls, Soviet resistance stiffens, German supply lines stretch to breaking point. And then comes Stalingrad, February 2, 1943. German Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrenders at Stalingrad after 5 months of the most brutal urban combat in human history. 91,000 Wehrmacht soldiers, all that remains of the 6th Army and elements of the 4th Panzer Army, march into Soviet captivity. Most will never return. The myth of German invincibility dies in the rubble of a city Hitler swore he would never abandon. The Eastern Front, once a blitzkrieg steamroller crushing everything before it, becomes a meat grinder consuming German divisions faster than they can be replaced. The Wehrmacht's aura of invincibility shatters. Soviet armies begin pushing west. July 10, 1943. Allied forces land in Sicily. Operation Husky, 160,000 troops, 3,000 ships, 4,000 aircraft striking the soft underbelly of Axis Europe. Mussolini's fascist regime collapses within weeks. Italy, Germany's oldest and most important ally, begins negotiating surrender. The Third Reich's southern flank crumbles. And in the skies over Germany itself, day and night without pause, British and American bombers hammer cities, railways, factories, and infrastructure. The RAF's Bomber Command, under Air Marshal Arthur Harris, a man whose nickname Bomber Harris, reveals everything about his philosophy of warfare, has abandoned precision strikes entirely in favor of area bombing. Massive raids designed not to hit specific factories or military installations, but to destroy entire urban centers. The goal is explicit: break German civilian morale, make the cost of supporting Hitler unbearable, turn Germany's cities into graveyards. Hamburg burns in Operation Gomorrah, a firestorm so intense it creates its own weather system, generating winds strong enough to uproot trees and hurl human bodies through the air like leaves. 9 square miles of the city simply cease to exist. 42,000 civilians die in a single night. The Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heart, is systematically demolished. Essen, Dortmund, Duisburg cities that produce the steel, coal, and chemicals that feed Germany's war machine are reduced to rubble and ash. Berlin suffers 163 major raids between 1943 and 1945. By war's end, 1/3 of the capital will be destroyed. 500,000 residents will be homeless. Germany's cities are dying, and with them, Germany's ability to wage war. But one category of target receives particular attention from Allied bombing planners, attention that directly impacts the rationale for Operation Vegetarian: food production facilities. Grain silos burn in Essen and Dortmund, sending flames hundreds of feet into the night sky. Dairy processing plants crumble in Munich and Stuttgart under the weight of high explosives. Meatpacking centers collapse in Hamburg and Bremen, burying equipment and workers under tons of concrete and steel. This isn't accidental. This isn't collateral damage. This is deliberate, systematic targeting based on careful intelligence analysis. Allied strategists have identified food supply as Germany's critical vulnerability. The same vulnerability Paul Fildes identified when he proposed Operation Vegetarian. But conventional bombing is achieving the disruption without crossing into biological warfare. Wehrmacht rations have already been reduced twice by late 1943. Soldiers in the field receive fewer calories than required for sustained combat operations. Civilian allocations in German cities are approaching starvation levels. In occupied territories, Poland, Ukraine, the Netherlands, people are already dying of hunger by the thousands, and Germany's livestock, the foundation of its protein supply, the very target Operation Vegetarian was designed to destroy, is dying, not from anthrax, from simple lack of feed. Reports suggest German cattle herds were already down by 30% by late 1943. The bombing campaign is working. Slowly. Brutally. But working. Germany is being starved without Britain needing to deploy anthrax, without crossing the moral threshold into biological warfare, without risking uncontrollable contamination across Europe, without inviting German retaliation with plague or typhus. Operation Vegetarian becomes redundant. November 11, 1943. Churchill's War Cabinet convenes for a routine strategic review in the underground cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall. The agenda includes updates on bomber effectiveness, planning for the invasion of France, naval operations in the Atlantic, and buried on page 7 of the briefing documents, status of Special Munitions Program. That's the euphemism for Operation Vegetarian, the code phrase that lets everyone in the room know what's being discussed without ever saying the word anthrax aloud. The briefing from military intelligence is blunt, almost anticlimactic given the enormity of what's being decided. Anthrax deployment no longer strategically necessary. Conventional bombing operations have achieved equivalent disruption to German food production infrastructure without attendant risks of biological contamination. Recommend program termination and stockpile disposal. Churchill listens, asks 3 questions about bomber casualty rates, German industrial capacity, and Soviet advances on the Eastern Front, then calls for a vote. The cabinet votes unanimously to shelve Operation Vegetarian. No debate, no dissent, just relief, perhaps, that they won't have to make the terrible choice after all. Production of anthrax-laced linseed cakes halts immediately. Orders go out to Porton Down. Cease all manufacturing operations related to Special Munitions Program. Dismantle production facilities. Destroy stockpiles, according to established safety protocols. But destroying 5 million doses of weaponized anthrax presents unique challenges. You can't simply dump anthrax in a landfill. The spores would survive, potentially contaminating groundwater for decades. You can't pour it down drains. Same problem, with the added risk of spreading through sewer systems into rivers and eventually the ocean. You can't bury it, can't dilute it, can't store it indefinitely without risking accidental release. The only reliable destruction method is incineration at temperatures exceeding 1000 degrees Celsius. Hot enough to break down the spore's protective protein shells and destroy the genetic material inside. Porton Down constructs special furnaces for the task, industrial-scale incinerators with sophisticated filtration systems to capture any airborne particles before they can escape. The process takes months. Throughout early 1944, technicians in full protective gear work in shifts around the clock. They feed the anthrax cakes into roaring flames, one container at a time, monitor exhaust systems continuously to ensure no viable spores escape, test ash samples to confirm complete sterilization, 5 million doses. Enough to devastate a continent, gone, reduced to sterile ash that's eventually buried in sealed concrete containers in undisclosed locations. The cluster bombs are dismantled, their casings are melted down and recycled into conventional munitions, regular bombs that will kill in ordinary ways rather than poisoning the earth for decades. Gruinard Island is sealed off with warning signs visible from the mainland and barbed wire along its beaches. Official records of the anthrax tests are stamped most secret, the highest classification level in the British system, locked in government archives, under restrictions that will keep them hidden for 3 decades. Scientists involved in Operation Vegetarian sign additional secrecy pledges. They're reminded, in language deliberately threatening, that discussing their work even decades later, even with family members, even on their deathbeds, violates the Official Secrets Act and carries penalties, including lengthy imprisonment. For 32 years, the British public has no idea their government planned to wage germ warfare on an industrial scale. No idea that anthrax cakes were manufactured by the millions. No idea that Gruinard Island became a toxic wasteland in the name of national security. The secret holds. Until it doesn't. And yet, the most dangerous part of this story was not the weapon itself, but what it revealed about the future of warfare. Because what Britain almost did in 1943 would echo through decades of Cold War tension, arms races, and conflicts that brought humanity to the brink of annihilation. But historians would spend the next 80 years debating a question that can never be fully answered. What if Britain had actually deployed Operation Vegetarian? What if conventional bombing hadn't worked? What if Germany had developed its own atomic weapons first, forcing Britain to respond with biological warfare? What if the war had turned catastrophically against the Allies in mid-1943, making anthrax seem like the only option to prevent Nazi victory? What would have happened? Here's the risk that still haunts strategic analysis. The nightmare scenario that Henderson tried to warn his superiors about. If anthrax had been used, millions of civilians might have starved not just Germans, but people across occupied Europe. Consider the cascading consequences. Think through the chain of events that would have followed. Germany in 1943 controlled France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Yugoslavia, Greece, and vast territories in the occupied Soviet Union. These weren't isolated regions. They were economically integrated. Food moved between them constantly. French grain fed German soldiers stationed in Poland. Dutch dairy products supplied Wehrmacht bases in Norway. Belgian meat reached German factory workers in the Ruhr. The entire occupied zone functioned as a single food distribution network. Now imagine anthrax-contaminated cattle entering that network. A cow in Bavaria contracts anthrax from a linseed cake dropped by an RAF bomber. Shows no symptoms for 72 hours. The standard incubation period. During that window, it's loaded onto a cattle car and transported by rail 300 kilometers to a slaughterhouse in occupied Prague. It arrives. It's herded into holding pens with dozens of other cattle from across Bohemia. It's slaughtered the next morning. The butchers notice nothing unusual. The animal seems healthy, well-fed, normal in every way. The carcass is processed. The meat is divided into portions. Those portions are distributed to 5 different cities across the Protectorate: Prague, Brno, Ostrava, Plzeň, Liberec. Each shipment reaches restaurants, military canteens, black market dealers, civilian ration distribution centers. Workers handling the carcass inhale spores. Butchers cut themselves on contaminated bones. By the time the first human deaths occur, hundreds of people across Czechoslovakia have been exposed, and the contaminated meat has already been consumed or redistributed further. Multiply that scenario across thousands of infection points, across every region where anthrax cakes fell, across every slaughterhouse, every market, every distribution center. Farmers slaughtering infected animals on their own land, a common practice in wartime when official slaughterhouses couldn't keep up with demand, would have exposed themselves and their families to lethal doses of anthrax spores. Entire farming communities could have been wiped out. Imagine being a farmer waking to find every cow in the pasture lying still, then falling ill yourself days later, watching your children develop the same symptoms, knowing there's no cure. Veterinarians investigating the mysterious sudden deaths of cattle across Germany would have contracted inhalation anthrax by performing autopsies and examining infected tissue. Most would have died within a week. Germany would have lost the very experts needed to understand and contain the outbreak. Local butchers processing meat from infected animals would have faced near certain death. The bacteria would have been in the blood, in the organs, coating every surface they touched. And contaminated products reaching black markets which flourished across occupied Europe as official ration systems broke down could have triggered outbreaks in cities hundreds of kilometers from the original drop zones. Black market meat traveled through informal networks that crossed borders. That reached into every community. That operated completely outside any tracking or containment system. There would have been no way to trace it, no way to stop it. The Third Reich would have faced not just famine, but plague. And here's what makes this scenario truly catastrophic. Anthrax doesn't stop when the immediate victims die. It persists. Every pasture where an infected animal grazed would remain contaminated. Spores in the soil, spores in the grass, spores that could infect new animals or new humans for decades. Every slaughterhouse that processed infected cattle would become a permanent biohazard zone. The buildings themselves would be toxic, the equipment unusable, the surrounding area dangerous. Every field, every barn, every market where spores settled would remain deadly for years, potentially for generations. Germany's agricultural capacity wouldn't just decline temporarily, it would collapse entirely and permanently. The land itself would become the enemy. Soil that couldn't be farmed, pastures that couldn't support livestock, fields that would kill anyone who tried to work them. The Allies would have won the war. Of that, there's little doubt. By late 1943, Germany was already losing. American industrial production was overwhelming. Soviet armies were advancing. The outcome was inevitable. But the Allies would have inherited a poisoned Europe. Think about the post-war implications. In our timeline, the timeline where Operation Vegetarian was shelved, Germany was divided into occupation zones. Allied and Soviet forces moved in. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe. Agriculture recovered within a few years. Populations stabilized. Cities were reconstructed. Life returned to something approaching normal within a decade. But in a timeline where Operation Vegetarian was deployed, occupation forces would have faced a completely different reality. Thousands of square kilometers of contaminated land across Germany and occupied territories. Land that couldn't be farmed, couldn't support livestock, couldn't be safely inhabited without extensive decontamination that might not even be possible with 1945 technology. You can't grow crops in anthrax-tainted soil. The spores would contaminate the plants. You can't graze cattle in contaminated pastures. They'd contract the disease and die, creating more contamination. You can't rebuild cities on poisoned ground. Construction workers would contract anthrax from disturbing the soil. Reconstruction would have required decades of decontamination work that, in 1945, Britain barely knew how to begin. The technology, the expertise, the resources, none of it, existed at the scale that would have been necessary. Germany might have remained a wasteland for a generation, perhaps longer, and the human cost, the civilian deaths from starvation, from disease, from exposure to contaminated environments, could have exceeded the casualties of the entire war itself. Could Britain have lived with that legacy? Could any nation? Gruinard Island became a monument to that nightmare, a warning of what almost happened. For over 40 years, it remained strictly off-limits, quarantined, forbidden. A small patch of Scotland rendered permanently toxic by human choice. Warning signs were posted on the mainland, visible to anyone approaching the coast. Gruinard Island. This island is government property under experiment. The ground is contaminated with anthrax and dangerous. Landing is prohibited by order of HM government. Royal Navy patrols enforced the exclusion zone, though they rarely needed to. Local fishermen avoided Gruinard's waters, fearing that fish might be contaminated. Sailing boats gave the island a wide berth. Stories circulated through highland villages, whispered tales of government experiments, of sheep that died in agony, of soil so poisoned it would never recover. Some stories were exaggerated, some were eerily accurate, but the truth remained locked in classified files. Soil tests conducted throughout the 1960s and 70s confirmed what Henderson had documented in 1942. The spores persisted with terrifying durability. Samples taken from the original test sites 20, 25, 30 years after Henderson's experiments still showed viable Bacillus anthracis. The bacteria hadn't died. It had simply waited, dormant in the soil, patient, ready to germinate again if disturbed. Rain couldn't wash it away. The spores bound chemically to soil particles, forming stable complexes that resisted erosion. Wind couldn't disperse it beyond the island's boundaries. The heather and grass trapped the spores close to the ground. Sunlight couldn't kill it. The spores' protective protein shells resisted ultraviolet radiation. Gruinard Island was, for all practical purposes, permanently toxic. A small patch of earth rendered uninhabitable by a handful of tests involving fewer than 100 sheep. Now imagine that contamination multiplied across thousands of square kilometers. Across entire nations. That's what Operation Vegetarian could have created. In the 1970s, pressure began mounting for the government to clean up Gruinard. Environmental activists argued that Britain had a moral obligation to restore the land it had deliberately poisoned. The island's original owner, old now, but still alive, wanted his property returned, wanted the chance to see sheep graze there again before he died. Scientists at Porton Down and other research institutions suggested that modern chemical treatments might be able to neutralize the anthrax spores. Technology had advanced since the 1940s. New understanding of bacterial biology pointed toward potential decontamination methods, but the government resisted for years. Multiple reasons explained the reluctance. First, cost. Decontaminating an entire island would be extraordinarily expensive, potentially millions of pounds for an uninhabited piece of land with no economic value. Second, publicity. Launching a major decontamination operation would inevitably draw public attention to Operation Vegetarian, a program that remained classified. Questions would be asked. Investigations would follow. The full scope of Britain's biological weapons program might be revealed. Third, uncertainty. Despite scientists' optimism, no one was absolutely certain decontamination would work. What if they spent millions of pounds treating the soil only to find that viable spores remained? The embarrassment, the political fallout, would be severe. So the government delayed, commissioned studies, held meetings, wrote reports, and did nothing. Then, in 1981, activists forced the issue in the most dramatic way imaginable. The Dark Harvest Commandos, never officially identified, believed to be a small group of environmental activists from the Scottish Highlands, with possible connections to the anti-nuclear movement, executed a plan that was equal parts political theatre and genuine threat. They landed on Gruinard Island illegally, evading whatever minimal security existed. They collected approximately 300 pounds of soil from areas they knew to be contaminated, based on publicly available scientific papers that had indirectly referenced the anthrax tests. Then they deposited packets of that soil at locations across Britain, including outside the main gates of Porton Down itself, accompanied by letters demanding immediate decontamination of the island. The message was brilliantly simple. If the government wouldn't clean up Gruinard, the contamination would spread anyway. We'll spread it ourselves. We'll force you to confront what you've tried to ignore. It was spectacular political theatre. It was also genuinely dangerous, potentially criminal, possibly insane. They were handling anthrax-contaminated soil without proper protection, transporting it across the country, leaving it in public places. But it worked. The government had no choice. The threat of anthrax contamination spreading beyond Gruinard, even if the actual risk was minimal, even if the dark harvest soil packets contained barely enough spores to pose real danger, was politically untenable. If anyone became ill, if contamination was detected at any of the locations where soil had been deposited, the scandal would destroy careers and possibly bring down the government. The decontamination of Gruinard Island began in 1986. The operation was massive, complex, unprecedented. Nothing like it had ever been attempted at this scale. Crews in full protective gear, modern hazmat suits far superior to what Henderson's team had worn, soaked the entire island in hundreds of tons of formaldehyde mixed with seawater. Formaldehyde is a powerful disinfectant, toxic to most forms of life. Capable of penetrating soil and destroying bacterial spores by denaturing their proteins. The mixture was sprayed from trucks, from handheld equipment, from helicopters hovering over hard-to-reach areas. Every square meter of Gruinard's 520 acres had to be thoroughly saturated. The process took months. Workers treated the island in sections, moving systematically from the original test sites outward. After treatment, they waited, collected soil samples, sent them to laboratories for analysis. If any viable spores remained, the section was treated again and again, until tests showed complete sterilization. The work was dangerous despite all precautions. Equipment malfunctioned, weather in the Scottish Highlands was unpredictable. Storms could blow in without warning, potentially spreading contaminated material before it was fully treated. Workers occasionally tore protective suits on rocks or thorny heather, requiring immediate decontamination and medical observation. But gradually, section by section, Gruinard was cleansed. Follow-up testing was rigorous. Hundreds of soil samples were collected from every part of the island. Each sample was cultured in laboratories, incubated under conditions ideal for anthrax growth, examined microscopically for any sign of bacterial activity. Only when every single test showed zero viable spores, when scientists were as certain as they could possibly be that Gruinard was safe, was the island declared decontaminated. In April 1990, 48 years after the first anthrax tests, the British government officially returned Gruinard Island to its owner's descendants. A small ceremony was held. Government officials made brief speeches about scientific progress and environmental responsibility, carefully avoiding any detailed discussion of what had actually happened on the island. Sheep grazed on Gruinard again that summer. Grass grew. Heather bloomed. Life returned to an island that had been dead for nearly half a century. But the legacy of Operation Vegetarian extends far beyond one decontaminated Scottish island. It reaches into the darkest corners of Cold War history and echoes in contemporary debates about weapons of mass destruction. The anthrax tests at Gruinard established protocols and methodologies that were later adopted or adapted by biological weapons programs around the world. Both the United States and the Soviet Union studied Britain's declassified research after 1975. Both learned from Henderson's findings about spore persistence and environmental contamination. Both applied those lessons to their own programs. The United States developed biological weapons throughout the Cold War. Anthrax, certainly, but also plague, tularemia, Q fever, Venezuelan equine encephalitis. Stockpiles were maintained. Delivery systems were designed. Tests were conducted at sites like WW2’s Proving Ground in Utah, following protocols remarkably similar to those used on Gruinard. The Soviet Union went further. Much further. Their biological weapons program, codenamed Biopreparat, employed thousands of scientists at dozens of facilities across the USSR. They developed anthrax strains resistant to antibiotics. They weaponized smallpox. They researched plague, Ebola, and genetically modified pathogens that had never existed in nature. The logic driving these programs was identical to the logic that created Operation Vegetarian. If the enemy has it, we need it too. If we don't develop it first, they might use it against us. Deterrence through the threat of retaliation. Mutual assured destruction applied to biological weapons exactly as it applied to nuclear weapons. The same calculations that drove Churchill in 1942 echoed through decades of arms races, proxy wars, and crises that brought humanity to the brink. What if the next conflict doesn't give us time to choose restraint? In 1975, as part of a broader trend toward governmental transparency, following the Watergate scandal and growing public distrust of official secrecy, the British government finally declassified documents related to Operation Vegetarian. The public response was immediate and visceral. Shock, outrage, disbelief. How could a democratic nation, Britain, the nation that had stood alone against Nazi tyranny, the nation that claimed moral superiority over totalitarian regimes, how could that nation have planned to wage biological warfare? How could it have deliberately designed a weapon intended to starve millions of civilians? How could scientists at prestigious universities, researchers who dedicated their careers to saving lives through medical research, have willingly participated in creating instruments of mass death? The answers were uncomfortable, deeply so. They challenged fundamental assumptions about morality, necessity, and the nature of justified warfare. Total war erases moral boundaries. When national survival seems at stake, when the enemy appears to threaten not just military defeat, but complete annihilation, ethical constraints that seem absolute in peacetime become negotiable. Survival overrides ethics. The end justifies means that would be unthinkable in any other context. And when nations believe their very existence is threatened, almost nothing is off the table. Not bombing civilians, not incendiary weapons that burn people alive, not biological weapons that poison the earth for generations. The revelation of Operation Vegetarian forced Britain to confront this reality, forced its citizens to ask whether their nation's behavior during World War II was fundamentally different from their enemy's behavior, whether being on the right side of history excused planning atrocities that were never committed only because conventional weapons proved sufficient. These weren't easy questions. They still aren't. Today, more than 80 years after Operation Vegetarian was conceived, and 50 years after it was declassified, the program matters for three critical reasons. First, it reminds us that biological weapons are not hypothetical threats or science fiction scenarios. They were researched, developed, tested, and very nearly deployed by one of history's most democratic governments, by a nation that prided itself on moral leadership, by scientists who were, in every other aspect of their lives, ordinary people committed to advancing human knowledge. The technology exists, the knowledge persists, and in an era of genetic engineering, synthetic biology, and CRISPR gene editing, creating new pathogens is easier now than it was in 1942. A moderately equipped laboratory and a team of competent biologists could potentially develop biological weapons that would make anthrax look primitive. That's not speculation. That's capability assessment from contemporary security analysts. Second, Operation Vegetarian forces us to confront the limits of deterrence theory. Churchill believed correctly, as it turned out, that the threat of German retaliation would prevent Britain from actually using anthrax. The logic of mutual assured destruction held. Both sides possessed the capability for biological warfare. Neither side used it, and the restraint born of mutual fear prevented catastrophe. But that logic only works under specific conditions. Both sides must be rational actors capable of calculating long-term consequences. Both must have reliable intelligence about the other's capabilities. Both must be able to control their own weapons programs and prevent unauthorized use. Both must value their own survival more than they value destroying their enemy. What happens when those conditions don't hold? When dealing with non-state actors who don't care about retaliation, with failing regimes that have nothing left to lose, with terrorist organizations that want maximum casualties rather than strategic advantage? The assumptions underlying deterrence theory, assumptions that prevented biological warfare in World War II and throughout the Cold War, may not apply to future conflicts, and that's terrifying. Third, Operation Vegetarian demonstrates how easily wartime secrecy can hide uncomfortable truths for decades. The program was buried for 32 years. An entire generation of British citizens lived, worked, paid taxes, and voted without knowing their government had manufactured 5 million doses of weaponized anthrax during World War II, without knowing that Gruinard Island had been turned into a toxic wasteland, without knowing how close their nation came to crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. How many other programs remain classified today? What other weapons were developed during World War II or the Cold War, or more recently, and then quietly shelved without public knowledge? What secrets are still locked in government archives under classifications that won't expire for another 50 years? The historical record is incomplete by design, and incomplete records leave room for repetition, for the same mistakes to be made again, for the same moral boundaries to be approached, crossed, or narrowly avoided without anyone learning the lessons that should have been learned. Gruinard Island is green again. Tourists occasionally visit, hikers looking for remote beauty, history enthusiasts curious about the anthrax tests. Sheep graze peacefully on grass that once held enough poison to sterilize a continent. The island looks pristine, recovered, healed. But beneath the surface, in soil that was saturated with formaldehyde, in earth where anthrax spores waited patiently for 44 years, lies a warning. Science can create miracles. Antibiotics that save millions of lives. Vaccines that eradicate diseases. Technologies that make human existence longer, healthier, more prosperous than ever before in history. But science can also create nightmares. Weapons that kill indiscriminately. Pathogens that spread beyond control. Technologies that poison the very ground beneath our feet for generations. And the distance between miracle and nightmare is often just one decision. One memo approved instead of rejected. One order given instead of withheld. One weapons program launched instead of shelved. Churchill never had to make that final decision. Germany never used biological weapons against Britain. Britain never dropped the anthrax cakes on German pastures. Operation Vegetarian remained a contingency plan, a backup option, a weapon prepared but never deployed. But the fact that it came so close that millions of doses were manufactured, that tests were conducted, that operational plans were drawn up, that bomber crews were trained, that everything was ready except the final political order tells us something essential about human nature and the logic of warfare. When survival is at stake, when nations believe they face existential threats, we are capable of anything, even the unthinkable, even actions that will haunt us for generations. Operation Vegetarian was not an aberration. It wasn't a unique moment of temporary insanity brought on by wartime desperation. It was a mirror. And what it reflected was the darkest edge of total war, the place where moral boundaries collapse under the weight of necessity, where civilized nations plan to commit acts they would condemn in peacetime, where the difference between defending civilization and destroying it becomes perilously thin. The weapon was buried, the documents were eventually declassified, the island was cleaned, but the questions Operation Vegetarian raised about science, morality, survival, and the price we're willing to pay for victory, those questions remain unanswered, because the next war may not be fought with bombs dropping from aircraft or armies clashing on battlefields. It may be fought with something far deadlier, something invisible, something that drifts unseen on the wind and poisons the earth for generations. Operation Vegetarian showed us that we have the knowledge to create such weapons. The 1980s showed us that we have the technology to deploy them. And history shows us, again and again, that when we believe we have no choice, we're capable of using them. When survival is at stake, humanity is capable of anything, even poisoning the very earth itself. The real question is, if the moment comes again, will we choose survival at any cost, or wisdom that spares the future? Will we repeat the mistakes of the past, or will we finally learn that some weapons should never be built because once created, they can never truly be unmade? Thank you for joining us today. Before you go, tell me in the comments, what's the most surprising detail you learned from this story? Was it the scale of Britain's preparation, the contamination that lasted for 44 years, or the fact that Churchill came so close to deploying anthrax against Germany? Your insights make this community stronger. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.